Good afternoon. This is Professor Abna Al-Deen talking about the plight of Muslims in China on Muslim Network TV and on the program Critical Talk. I have with me again this afternoon Professor Dru Gladney, who is the Chair of Anthropology at Pomona College in California, where it's nice and warm. I'm going to send him some snow as soon as this broadcast is over. You're more than welcome. I want to continue our conversation, and if we could get played the khutbah and Dru, after it plays, and we can leave a picture of it up on the screen, can tell us what's going on here and who's there and why they're there and what you all are doing. Go, Connor.
My good wishes in regards to you
他没有来过，欢迎他来。
and welcome him here.
所以这个景色呢是个中国式的，是楼台平间。أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمد حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح الله أكبر الله أكبر.
So tell us about what's going on here.
Mashallah, Amina, thank you so much for having me again.
Oh, it's all right.
That takes me right back to Xi'an, the ancient capital of China known as Chang'an. And this is the great mosque. If anybody has visited Xi'an, almost everyone is taken to this mosque, where I led a group of travelers and tourists with the Smithsonian Museum. I think this is around 1986 or 87. And this is Imam Ma Liangji Muhammad al-Nusur, who is the head imam of the mosque for many, many years. And he is a very dear friend of mine. And he basically welcomes anyone to come visit the mosque to show off how Muslims in China have been able to survive and in some cases prosper under the current government's policy of freedom of religion. Now, this is not what you're hearing these days when we think about the Uyghurs and repression towards Muslims. But in the late 80s and early 90s, Muslims were doing pretty good in China. And Imam Ma welcomed me in not only his mosque, but his home and this group of tourists. And at the very end, you see this young woman, a Catholic woman, and she's moved in her prayer. And she was one of the tour members. Also, Hugh Downs was with us on this trip. He passed away last year at the age of 99. And his wife, Ruth, was there. And he remarked to me, I remember Hugh Downs very clearly saying he had no idea that Muslims in China had become so well integrated into Chinese culture, and at the same time had so well preserved their Islamic identity. And in my book, I quote Imam Ma, and he said, we Muslims, we Hui Muslims, we look Chinese on the outside, like our mosques, like his mosque. But on the inside, this man here said, we are very Muslim. And I think that's a nice metaphor for Islam in China today, particularly among the Hui. Imam Ma, I actually saw him in 2014 on a trip. And he's still there and he's still leading prayer.
Wow. And I know my viewers don't know the history of the association of the surname Ma with Muslim Chinese. Could you give us a mini lecture on that?
Well, there's a great saying that says, 是个会会就行嘛，不行嘛就行哈，不行哈就行啦. It's a long saying that goes that out of 10 Hui Muslims, 9 are named Ma. And if they're not named Ma, they're named Ha. And if they're not surnamed Ha, they're surnamed La. And why 9 out of 10 Hui are often, not always, but surname Ma is it's the best guess is that when Muslims came into China 1,300, 1,200 years ago, they all had Arabic names and no surnames. So many of them, of course, were named Muhammad or Mahmud. So the Chinese just took their names and a syllable, the first syllable of the name, and they gave them the character Ma. An alternative explanation is that many of them came as leading caravans and tending horses. So they took on the name of their trade. And that Ma is the character for horse in Chinese.
Well, I had read, and I don't know if it's fact or fiction, something about one of the Ma's, who was this famous seaman. Is that a fiction?
I'm not sure which. You might be thinking of Zheng He,
Mm.
and he's I call him the Chinese Sinbad. In the
No.
Ming Dynasty, he led expeditions under the Ming Emperor to explore the Indian Ocean, maybe even made the Hajj to Mecca and all of East Africa. And these expeditions, about 60 years before Columbus discovered America, were led by this sailor, admiral, named Zheng He. But his original Chinese name was actually Ma as well.
That's it.
When he entered Chinese service, the Chinese, and rose through the ranks of the Confucian examination system and became a scholar official and an admiral, he changed his name to Zheng He, partly maybe to blend in. He also became a eunuch, so he gave his all for his country. And he is now buried in Quanzhou. But also there's a cemetery and a tomb for him near Kunming, which is in Yunnan. And that's where he was raised, where there's a large Hui Muslim population to this day. Zheng He is celebrated in China today because they say he even may have been the first to discover America. Most scholars doubt that. But he explored most of the Indian Ocean with a huge fleet, the size of which was never matched until World War I. And the ships were about 5 times the size of the ships that Columbus sailed to America 60 years later.
Wow. Yeah, I remember, I don't know, might have been in your book, might have been somewhere else, and I was saying, oh my goodness, really? Well, one of the things that kind of piecemeal comes down to us is Mao's treatment of or working with, seems to have depended with the Chinese Muslims. Can you tell us a little bit about that era of time?
Absolutely. Well, you've probably heard of the Long March, where Mao and the early communists were literally chased through southern China by the nationalists right on the eve of the Sino-Japanese War prior to World War II, when Japan was moving into China. And the communists fled through southern China. And as they wound their way through minority areas near the border of what is today Vietnam and Burma, they went through minority areas and they realized that unless the local peoples, the minorities, at that time, many of them were quite independent, helped them, they could not have survived. And one of the large groups of minorities as they moved west were not only Tibetans, but also Muslims. And where the long marches ended up settling in the region now known as Shanxi. You may have heard of Yan'an and the Yan'an caves where the long marchers ended up.
Mm-hmm.
That was a heavily Muslim area. So very early on, Mao and his supporters realized that if they were going to survive, they had to talk turkey. They had to make deals with these minority ethnic groups like Tibetans, like the Hui, and they promised them autonomy and even the possibility of independence following the old Soviet model. Of course, they had Soviet advisors on the Long March, and already the Soviet republics of Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan had been set up. So that model was handed to the early Chinese communists by the Soviets. Now, when they finally got into power, the Mao was smart enough to say, well, we'll give you recognition, but we won't allow you the opportunity to succeed, to gain independence, like they did in the former Soviet Union. And so very early on, the communists realized, listen, we can't offend the Muslims. So he cautioned his soldiers to be careful about the use of pork among Muslims, to not make remarks about their customs. And they would post signs on their walls saying, respect local customs. Now they have this autonomous region system, Ningxia Hui Autonomous Region for the Hui Muslims, Xinjiang Uyghur for the Uyghur Muslims, Tibet, of course, for the Tibetans. That system was worked out by the Long Marches, and the first autonomous county was for the Hui in what is now the Ningxia Hui Autonomous Region.
So much history, and you don't learn it in American social, I guess there's social sciences in high school. So you don't, I learned when my kids were in the 10th grade that we do world history from an American point of view. And if we weren't there, you don't know. So it's, I got a map here and I'm trying to look at, okay, I see Tibet, that's west. And then you're talking about Xinjiang, I can't say it.
Xinjiang. Yeah, Xinjiang. Those are hard letters for us to pronounce, I know.
I know, up a little bit north.
Of course, the Uyghurs, they call it Eastern Turkestan. They don't like that word Xinjiang.
Oh.
Because in Chinese, that word Xin is new and Jiang is territory. So it's a very colonial term, meaning new territory that the Chinese have claimed.
So if we were to trace Mao's journey, where would we start?
You see Shanghai on the far right of your map, the red, yeah. So, of course, the early communists started out in Shanghai as an urban, rather intellectual society. But then they moved down into Jiangxi and established a mountain kind of encampment.
Okay.
And then when they began to war and have a falling out with the nationalists, they had to flee south, directly south, towards, down through the northern part of Guangdong, into Guangxi, which is the Zhuang Autonomous Region. The Zhuang people are down there, then in through Yunnan, and on into Sichuan, and then up north, where they ended up in where you see the Shanxi with a double AANXI, and Shanxi next to what is now Ningxia, the Ningxiang Autonomous Hui Autonomous Region. So this is where they made this huge loop.
My goodness.
And that as they got into the west, that's where they came through Tibetan areas and into the Muslim areas of Gansu, Ningxia, Shanxi, Qinghai. And that's where they had to make deals with powerful ethnic groups like the Tibetans, like the Muslim warlords. Now, this western region at the time, this is where we get that Ma name again, was divided among 5 Hui warlords, all related to each other, all surnamed Ma. And the communists and the nationalists had very little power in this area. It was basically they had to deal with the local Muslim warlords, characters like you may have heard of one general named Ma Bufang, who was in Qinghai, and distant cousins that basically control this region. So, when the last empire of China, the Qing dynasty, which was run by the Manchu people, who also got autonomous regions and recognition, when it was defeated 1911, 1912, the nationalists took over China. And then they basically started this system of recognizing national groups, which included the Hui as one of the Muslim groups. Remember the five peoples of China? They included Tibetans. They included the Hui as the Muslims. They included the Zhuang, this group in the south. So the nationalists recognized five groups, and the communists then took that model and they recognized 55 minority groups and divided the Hui Muslim group into 10 separate groups. And all this nationalist policy, this is the nationalist era when nation states needed to establish a national identity to survive, under Westphalian treaties and the rise, post World War I period. And Sun Yat-sen, who I'm sure you've heard of, basically said, we Chinese, we have a sense of family, but we don't have a sense of nation. So nationalists in China wanted to promote the idea of a nation, a Chinese nation, with the Han as a majority. Similar to sort of white nationalism in the United States, we have a sort of an umbrella group, and often minority and ethnic communities are used as a way to be stigmatized, to homogenize a rather amorphous majority, like whites, Euro-Americans, that mask sort of, European or Polish or,
Well, we're going to take a quick break and come back. I have so many. I could do this for the rest of the year, every day, and still wouldn't know enough. But we're going to take a quick break. This is Professor Al-Deen, and I'm talking with Professor Dru Gladney on Chinese Muslims and everything Chinese. We'll be right back.
Billboards are popping up all over the country with an...
Our neighbors don't realize that Muslims are absolutely opposed to ISIS.
Salam. My name is Abdul Malik Mujahid. I'm an imam in Chicago.
16 shots! No me! No justice! No me!
So how do we bring up the energy which can really have an impact on the world? You need to build bridges of understanding among people, and we need to have America moving forward.
That lesson learned brought the strength of humanity to America, which is the diversity.
Mujahid Talks, only on Muslim Network TV. Faithfully connected.
Now, I was captured by your last statement. We understand ourselves as a family, but we don't understand ourselves as a nation.
Yeah.
Would you say a little bit more culturally about how that works and why the rise of the nation state made it almost imperative for folks to reconfigure and rethink themselves and their neighbors?
Well, in China, of course, lineage and has always been a very important source of authority and power and history. And Chinese villages were organized around families and lineages, many of them who shared one surname. And Chinese, like Ma or Zhang or Ma or Chen, or Wang, and over the course of 5,000 years of Chinese history, they were very careful not to allow close intermarriage of people with the same surname, what we anthropologists call same surname exogamy. So they had to find other Chinese lineages to intermarry with. And often women were very critical in the role of knitting this network of families. Now, the Hui Muslims weren't autochthonous to China. Muslims in China, the Hui especially, might be considered one of the world's earliest diaspora because they came to China on the ancient Silk Roads and they settled. And many of these Muslim traders, vast majority were men, settled and took on local Chinese wives, maybe a second or a third wife in their case, and then may have adopted children into their family and raised them as Muslim. And Muslim growth, population growth in China probably took place mostly through intermarriage and biological growth rather than through conversion.
Okay.
There were some limited conversions in China, but not as much as through growth. So the Muslims followed this pattern of lineage power and built lineages like the Ma family lineages through this system. When the nationalists came in, they realized they had to break that up because they couldn't command loyalty.
Yeah.
If people were loyal to their father and to their grandfather and to their great, they would never be loyal to the government.
Okay.
Of course, the emperor was supposed to be the son of heaven, and they were supposed to all be loyal to him. So nationalists had to overthrow the old imperial system, introduce a new way of thinking, a Western way that did not sit easily on Chinese ideas of family and race. The idea of race and racism was introduced to China by the West. You know, we give Chinese a lot of bad things, and that's one of them. Gunpowder they did on their own, but then taught them how to make them into weapons.
Yeah. Wow. I was watching, it's been a while, this series on, I think it's called The Story of China. It's a British production, and it's really good, but it has holes, you know, because you want to ask the question and you can't because it's a video. But it's a very interesting, I guess, how the British and the West, because Britain was the West, literally, takes all of these ideas which are foreign, and then the people, their job is to make them fit, you know, however it is one makes something fit. And then you have the Opium Wars and but you know, I can't get out of my head little bitty Japan thinking it's going to conquer China. Was it that they didn't know how large China was?
Well, they had technological superiority, which they also got from the West.
Yeah.
Right? And the Japanese were very quick, partly because they were probably, you know, an island nation.
Yeah.
They were quick to learn and adapt Western innovations and technologies. And China, because it was a landmass, it didn't need these technologies to rule. It wasn't a maritime power at that.
Okay.
It had been in the past. So it resisted Western innovations, knowing full well that they would probably lose power. And of course, the whole idea, as we're seeing in Washington, D.C. these days, people are often reluctant to give up their throne. And for some reason, you know. And also history, I think I really appreciate your pointing this out, Amina, because we also neglect our history of the Native Americans and the diversity. We think of this country as a tabula rasa, you know, when I grew up. We weren't told about the extraordinary history of colonialism, Spanish, French, British, and what that did to the native populations and how they suffered, and the diversity that led to our current day dilemma of slavery and this kind of domination of the marginalized and the others. China did the same thing with these indigenous peoples like the Uyghur, like the Tibetans. If they didn't get with the program, the nationalist program, they were dominated. Under the empire, you know, it didn't really matter. If you just said, yes, the emperor, I'll give you some tribute. I'll give you some trade, silks, rugs, ice, tea, in case of Tibet. We'll leave you alone. But under nationalism, you know, you want to set up a border. You want to have your army defend that border. And if you have to run over a few millions, in China's case, indigenous peoples. You know, they don't even use the word indigenous in China. They don't recognize, say, Tibetans were indigenous to Tibet. They call them a minority nationality. And that whitewashes literally the history of Tibetan, history of independence. And this is what the Uyghurs claim about Eastern Turkestan. That by calling it Xinjiang, it just says it's the territory of China. But as I point out to my Chinese colleagues, you better change the name if you want to claim the area has always been part of China, because Xinjiang means new territory. It's a colonial term. I use Michael Hector's theory of internal colonialism, which also works on the American West. He used it for Ireland, of how a kind of settler colonialism inside your borders is used to dominate, extract resources, and subject the native peoples.
Oh, I gotta take a course with you long distance because I need to know some more. I'm gonna segue and I want to talk about what's behind your head.
Behind my head, a bald spot. Oh, you mean? Yeah, well, there.
Scroll.
This is Islamic art from China, made by the Hui people, the largest Muslim community of China, sometimes called the Chinese Muslims. I don't like that term because it suggests that they're mostly Chinese and then Muslims later. The title of my first book, I called them Muslim Chinese.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you've ever opened it up and you've looked at that full picture.
I have tabs in there.
It was hard to get Harvard Press to do that. But they were protesting right before Tiananmen. We talked a little bit about the tank man last time. And the Muslims had been allowed to protest in Tiananmen Square by the government. And the Muslims were upset about a book that had been offensive to Islam. But the government used the Muslims to say, see, we allow protest. This is a democratic society. These Muslims were unarmed. In fact, they were escorted through Tiananmen Square. And they got a lot of their demands. The book was made, was banned in China. The authors were arrested, some say for their own protection. And the government honored demands of these Muslims. But really, most of us think that it was a kind of a play to say that the students in Tiananmen Square were illegal. They didn't get permission to protest. And it gave them the right later to carry out the suppression with tanks in Tiananmen Square, massacring. Some people say up to 3,000 poor students, defenseless students. And the tank guy was stopping it. But, Chinese history is fascinating, but I think what we're seeing here is this is the kind of stuff you don't see in China, this kind of artwork very often. And also the history of the Muslims of China, because like our history, we often exclude the other and the minority, and we present a narrative of majority and a kind of glorious history, George Washington and Columbus. But as we learn more about history, we realize it's much more complicated, and generally the native peoples are the ones that suffer. In this case, when they're allowed to pursue their own art, they come up with this amazing just combination of Chinese aesthetics with Islamic, in this case Arabic aesthetic. Over my left shoulder, over here, wait, there it goes. There it goes. I gotta get it. There we go. If you're Chinese from far away, that looks like the Chinese character for show or longevity. But if you get up close to it, you realize it's Arabic. In some cases, they use a surah from the Quran to write it. Mm-hmm. And in Arabic, it would be, it's a bismillah. Mm-hmm. And over my right shoulder, at the bottom, what looks like a calendar to you perhaps, are these square Chinese characters, which is actually the Shahada, the statement of faith. Mm-hmm. There's no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his messenger. And above is the Arabic Shahada, but it's written in a kind of circular form to make it look like a Chinese painting from far away.
does.
And this beautiful blend, because of course, Chinese tradition and Arabic, Middle Eastern tradition have great calligraphic traditions. They love calligraphy.
I know, but one goes linear and the other one goes right to left. And you're saying, whoa, how do you marry those two?
Well, and unfortunately, as you would know much better than myself, I mean, that conservative Islam, in some cases, generally Salafi or Wahhabi Islam, often critical of this combination of Chinese culture or non-Middle Eastern, non-Arabic culture with Islam. So
they just want to cut off all that is Islam and just have it for themselves and make it a territorial faith tradition.
Or an Arab Islam, right?
Well, that's retarded.
And so Chinese Muslims who are very proud of their heritage, who claim descent from the early Arab, in some cases Persian and Turkish and Mongolian Muslim immigrants to China. They want to preserve that heritage, but also combine it with Chinese culture.
Right.
And that's why you see these beautiful mosques, like where Imam Ma in Xi'an was leading the prayer that we started our show up. So here we see this beautiful combination, but much of it is being taken down in China today because of criticism by more conservative Orthodox Muslims, saying you shouldn't combine local culture, local ideals with Islam. I think it's unfortunate. I'm not a Muslim. I celebrate this amalgamation of culture. And also it's the indigenization, the localization, to quote Clifford Geertz, of Islam in China.
Exactly.
Now, recently we've seen the government in China has been criticizing the Arabicization of Chinese Islam. And the government is actually encouraging this kind of thing.
Yeah.
And they want Chinese-style mosques like the one in Xi'an. They want to take off the domes. They want to eradicate the Arabic, the writing of the Shahada on signs and things like that for halal. And they want to only use Chinese. So the poor Muslims, the Hui, they're getting it from both sides. They're getting it from the Orthodox Muslims, and they're getting it from the government, and they're caught in the middle. But that's the history of the Muslims in China. They've always been caught in the middle. And despite that, they've survived 1,300 years, often of severe persecution, because they wouldn't worship the emperor. And then they wouldn't worship Mao. And they didn't eat pork. How are you going to survive in China if you don't eat pork?
I know. I don't know if you have in your office a symbol of the pure and true.
Yeah, I don't know if I can grab one very quickly.
Well, let's take a break, and I'm going to come back, hit that, and I also want to go back to the Uyghur, and then I want to go to the women's mosque. We're going to take a break. This is Professor Al-Deen with Professor Dru Gladney, and we're talking about the plight of Muslims in China and much Chinese history that none of us knew. We'll be right back.
Assalamu alaikum!
I love Adam's world because it makes me learn in a fun way. That Adam has a green face and orange hair. I like this song. I like how Adam sings. I like Adam's world because it makes me happy. What? No. And here's Adam and here's Anissa. Adam and his sister. Adam is a boy and he is very smart.
Download the new Adam's World app at adamsworldapp.com and let's help tomorrow's Muslims today.
This is Professor Al-Deen with Professor Dru Gladney, and we are looking at Chinese Muslims. Did you find my picture of the pure and true?
I didn't find a great one. Unfortunately, I have quite a few of those things at home, but not here in my office. This is from my little book, Ethnic Identity in China. I can't get this camera figured out. And you can see this, what looks like a pagoda.
Yeah.
That's actually the minaret. This is the mosque in Beijing, in downtown Beijing. Inside it, there's quite a few photographs. I'll try to get this in close. You can see Chinese and Arabic. This is Chinese. And that's the characters for Qing and Zhen, pure and true. That's halal. But you can see in Arabic, halal, and then also here in Russian.
Yeah, I'm looking at that. That's different.
And above we have in Uyghur and Arabic and in English, Muslim restaurant. You see that?
Yeah, you know, I used to, when I was teaching about in my Muslims in global context, I had a picture, and like you, it's somewhere else. I don't even know where it is. But I would show it in class and get students to copy it so they could find the Chinese restaurants.
Yeah. And generally, you know, until recently when they started removing the Arabic, you would just look for Arabic.
Yeah.
And generally, you know, that would be halal.
Right.
Also, the Hui would use a picture of a teapot, a little teapot. Why? Not only because they love tea and they traded tea on the caravan routes on the Silk Road, but also because they would use water in the tea to wash themselves. So and the Chinese translation of halal is Qing and Zhen. And Qing is same characters, Qing dynasty means pure. And Zhen means true. So Chinese is the religion of the pure and the true. So the way, you know, preserve that idea that they're pure through washing and not eating pork, and they worship one God, the true God, Allah, not the many gods in a Chinese polytheistic society that they found around them.
But that is so eloquent.
It is. It's a beautiful combination, right, of Islamic morality and ideals and Chinese aesthetics. And I think this is the key to Hui's success. It took them a while to do this. I mean, they've had their ups and downs. They've been under Chinese rule for 1,300 years.
Yeah.
The Uyghur situation is very different because, as we noticed, the term Xinjiang is new, and it wasn't used in the region until 1884. Prior to that, that region was only loosely, occasionally controlled by China along the Silk Road. It was very independent. There were at least 2 Uyghur independent nations that were recognized internationally, short-lived in 1933 and 1944. But international governments recognized them. They had elected democratic governments in what is now Xinjiang. Like Tibet had internationally recognized government. And now Uyghurs and Tibetans have governments in exile. So they have this long history of independence that the Hui never had, because the Hui were never concentrated in one place. 95% of all Uyghur are in that region of Eastern Turkestan.
So that's why people are able to see them as different with different stuff, and then moves can be made to bring them into the fold, so to speak. We have a wonderful comment from somebody. Is there any sense of unity or solidarity between different Muslim groups in China? Do the Hui support and advocate for the Uyghur?
Yes and no. Solidarity in terms of Islam, they all face Mecca in the same direction, and they all worship the same God and pray in the same mosques very often. But when it comes to politics, that's where they divide. And that really is a problem for Muslims in China, because I think I mentioned in our last show that this divide and rule policy, the communists in China got that from the Soviets and their masters at it. So they use nationalism and linguistic politics to separate and divide and rule. So they'll pit one group against another. And in regions like Xinjiang, it's often not just the Uyghur and the Hui that don't like each other. It's also the Kazakhs. Kazakhs are Turkic. They're also Central Asian. And they should normally be closer to the Uyghur because they share a similar history and past and culture and things like that. The lamb and diet and things like. But the government has been very, very effective at pitting the Kazakhs against the Uyghur, putting one Kazakh in position over Uyghur, blaming the Hui for this or that. And the Uyghurs often think the Hui are too pro-China. They look Chinese. They take off their white caps and they blend in, unlike the Uyghurs. And indeed, I've seen this happen. There'll be a protest of several Muslim groups together, like we saw in right prior to Tiananmen. But when the government starts to crack down, the Hui can more easily blend in. They speak perfect Mandarin wherever they live or wherever Chinese. Whereas the Uyghurs, Kazakhs, and other Muslims have to learn Chinese as a second language. Whereas Hui will speak Cantonese natively if they grow up in Canton. Right?
Wow. So let's talk about the women's mosque.
Yeah.
One of my favorite topics.
It's a great topic. And I talked about it very early in my early research. I mentioned it in my dissertation. But even then, it didn't strike me as that unusual because I was an anthropologist looking at the Hui in China. Yeah. And I didn't realize that in world Islam, there are very few women's mosques that are, there are prayer rooms and curtained off areas for women. Very rarely, except on the Hajj, I understand, do women and men pray together, intermixed. Right. You'll have to explain that one to me. I don't know why they can do that. I've been with Sufi groups where women and men are together. What's that?
I said you don't want to hear my explanation because that's the rest of it is crazy. But go ahead.
I would love to hear that.
Okay, we'll talk.
The women's mosques in China. I should mention that it's very unusual in the Muslim world, as far as I understand. For in China, we have completely independent mosques or buildings, masjid, prayer halls, that are separate from the men's mosques or in a courtyard or divided by a concrete wall. Now, in the village outside of Beijing where I did my initial field work, they had a separate room detached from the men's prayer hall, but they would have a speaker,
right,
so that they would listen to the call to prayer and the khutbah, the sermon, by the male imam. But the female imam would be trained in a madrasa run by other women imams. Now, it boils down to semantics. Is this a mosque or is it just a prayer hall? Now, in Islam, I understand it doesn't really matter. But if you split hairs, in Chinese, they rarely use the Arabic terms for these prayer halls. They use Chinese terms.
Right.
So they call them a prayer hall.
Right.
And they call the masjid a prayer hall, which is the Arabic. But is it technically a mosque? A government official will say, no, the mosque is the main mosque where the men pray. But we have women's mosque, completely independent. And we have madrasa run by women who have been trained to train other women.
Right.
And this is a phenomenon that's mostly in northern China, Central Plains. There have been some scholars who have worked on this. None of them, to my satisfaction, have really answered the question, why China?
Right.
And the women's mosque, because we don't have many women's temples. Now, Buddhism, we have female nuns and nunneries. Maybe they got it from there. Sufism has been a very strong influence on Islam in China, especially among the Uyghurs, but also among the Hui. And in Sufism, there are Sufi tekkes among particularly the Qadariya Hui Muslims, where women and men pray together. But in this case, what you'll love, Amina, is that they don't call it a mosque or prayer hall. They call it a Taoist hall. Tao is the word in Chinese for Taoism or Taoism, the Tao, for the way.
Right.
The imam in this Sufi order is not called an imam. He's called a Daosher, a Taoist master.
Right.
So they use the language of mystical Taoism to express the glory of God in Sufi teaching, the way. And I think this is just another example. And among those Sufis, you really get this beautiful artwork.
Yeah, well, you know, when I was reading, one of the things, I know I'm going to mispronounce it, the Nushi, the women imams, N-U-S.
Nushur, maybe they're sometimes called Nushur, female teacher.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I was
In
impressed.
Chinese, they generally call it ahong, new ahong. Ahong is a Persian word for teacher, ahong, right?
You know, that they had taken over a lot of the social work kind of chores.
Absolutely.
It's great. But and didn't have to feel that they were being shut out or shut off. And those who wanted to become these teachers, you know, imams, that's something they could choose to do without a whole lot of hoopla.
And of course, in China, traditionally Chinese really value education.
Right.
So women were encouraged, often on their own, often independently, not rarely in a public institution.
Right.
But if they excelled in Arabic and Persian sometimes, they gained great stature in their community.
Yeah.
And also in terms of social organization, you mentioned in terms of literacy, caring for the poor and the sick, women in China in general, but also among the Hui, have taken a very strong role. We've been talking a little bit about Xi'an. We started with Imam Ma. It's Xi'an City where the women's organizations there have played an extraordinarily strong role, both in developing the Muslim quarter, but also in promoting social reforms, educational reforms, cleaning the streets. The city is one of the cleanest cities you could ever go. It's a huge outdoor restaurant area where you would think, often in everywhere in the world, we have outdoor markets and restaurants, it's filthy, but not in Xi'an. Those women won't let you. They won't let you litter, and you don't want to tangle with them.
Awesome. That is, just awesome. I'm trying to think of a way. What do you think as a parting shot? And I might have to dial you up again later in our new year. What do you think is going to be the difference between the Trump administration in China and the Biden administration in China?
Well, it used to be the silly season during the electoral period. Now it's the scary season.
I know. Yeah.
And if you've noticed, every 4 years, everybody wants to beat up China on both sides of the aisle.
Yeah.
Whether Democrats or Republicans. You don't want to be a panda hugger in the election season. And so both sides have been beating up China. Biden, not as much.
Okay.
He's certainly a lot more tact.
Mm-hmm.
And hopefully that will be his policy. Jake Sullivan, his foreign policy advisor, has had a long period of time of studying China, working in China. And I believe Biden will have a much more nuanced and much more textured approach to China. However, my Uyghur friends are very worried because it's under Trump and the Republicans that they've received a lot of support and attention. Marco Rubio has been supporting the Uyghurs. Steve Bannon.
Are you kidding?
Uyghurs. And also these Uyghur laws have been passed with the highest level of bipartisan support that of any law in the U.S. 3 laws have been passed in the Senate, 2 in Congress, all supporting the Uyghurs, condemning China, applying that Magnitsky Act, which was designed to punish Russia and the Soviet Union, and turning it on China. Over 37 entities, companies in China have been blacklisted, many of them based in Xinjiang, and all with U.S. government support. And the Uyghurs are going, yes, finally, people are hearing our story. And it's under this Republican administration.
I don't think
they didn't get any support from Obama, they didn't think. They got some, but not public. Because China is much more nuanced.
But I don't know that people knew this. I'm sorry, we're out of time. But as usual, I will dial you back up, put my scrolls in the mail. This is Professor Al-Deen talking with Professor Dru Gladney, and we're talking about the plight of Muslims, but also the history of Muslims in China. Please have happy holidays, and I'll see you again soon.
Always lovely talking with you.
Stay around.